The judge's hand stopped halfway down the page. That's the moment I knew my parents understood they had lost. Until then, my father had looked almost relaxed in his expensive gray suit, leaning back in his chair like a man already planning a celebration dinner. My mother sat beside him with her pearl earrings and soft little smile, the same smile she wore whenever she thought someone else was about to be humiliated. And that someone had always been me. By sunset, my father had said only minutes earlier, loud enough for half the courtroom to hear, every Florida property will legally be ours. Mom gave a quiet laugh. She should be grateful we left her anything at all. I didn't answer them. I just sat there in my white navy dress uniform with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the old wooden railing in front of me, while the ceiling fans hummed overhead. The courtroom in Sarasota smelled faintly like paper furniture polish, and rain drifting in from the parking lot outside. Florida thunderstorms had rolled in early that afternoon, turning the windows gray. Most people in the room probably thought I looked calm. I wasn't calm. I was 62 years old, retired after 33 years in the Navy, and I still felt like the unwanted daughter sitting at my parents' dinner table trying not to say the wrong thing. Then Judge Holloway unfolded Aunt Margaret's letter. He adjusted his glasses once. "Read the first line," and froze. The silence that followed felt so complete I could hear the rain tapping against the courthouse windows. "Well," he said quietly. Then he looked directly at me. "That changes everything." My father's face drained white so fast it frightened me. Mom's hand tightened around her purse. And for the first time in my life, neither of them knew what to say. 3 hours earlier, before court began, I'd stood alone outside the building watching the storm clouds gather over Main Street. I remember touching the edge of my uniform jacket, feeling suddenly foolish for wearing it. My father hated seeing me in uniform. Said it embarrassed him. "You always look like you're trying to prove something," he once told me at Thanksgiving about 15 years earlier. Maybe I had been. But that morning I wore it because Aunt Margaret had asked me to years ago. If they ever corner you, she'd told me during one of our late-night phone calls, don't walk in there looking ashamed. You served your country. Let them look ashamed. I could still hear her voice clearly even after 6 months. Margaret wasn't really my aunt by blood. She was my mother's older cousin, though everyone just called her Aunt Margaret. She owned several modest rental properties along the Gulf Coast. Nothing glamorous, mostly duplexes and small apartment buildings filled with retirees, veterans, and working families who'd lived there for years. To my father, they were assets. To Margaret, they were people. That was the difference. And that difference was exactly why we ended up in court. My younger brother Daniel sat beside my parents that morning, scrolling through his phone before the hearing even started. 58 years old and still acting like consequences were things that happened to other people. He looked up when he saw me entering the courtroom. "Well," he muttered, "look who came dressed for her own funeral." Dad chuckled. I ignored him and took my seat across the aisle. That had become my survival strategy decades earlier: silence. Not weakness. Silence. There's a difference older people understand better than younger ones. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep from saying something you can never take back. Growing up in Jacksonville in the 1970s, I learned early that my brother and I lived under different rules. Daniel was charming, funny, athletic. I was serious. Too serious, according to my father. When Daniel forgot chores, Dad laughed it off. When I forgot something, Dad called it irresponsibility. By high school, Daniel could do almost anything and still be treated like the family success story. Meanwhile, I got lectured for wanting independence. Especially after I joined ROTC. "You're too stubborn to be a wife," my father told me once when I was 21. "Now you want to play soldier too." That sentence stayed with me longer than I care to admit. Not because it hurt at the time. Because part of me spent decades trying to prove him wrong. The strange thing is, military life suited me better than family life ever did. The Navy made sense. Work hard, tell the truth, protect the people beside you, earn your place. Simple. Families weren't simple. Especially mine. Over the years, I missed birthdays, anniversaries, funerals, and holidays because of deployments. The further my career advanced, the colder my relationship with my parents became. My promotions irritated my father instead of impressing him. By the time I made commander, he'd stopped asking questions altogether. But Aunt Margaret never stopped calling. Sometimes from hospital rooms. Sometimes after hurricanes. Sometimes because she was lonely. And sometimes because she was scared. Especially during the last few years. "I think Richard's hiding things from me," she whispered once during a call while I was stationed in Bahrain. I sat alone in my quarters at nearly midnight listening to her shaky breathing over the phone. What kind of things? Money, papers, I don't know anymore. I urged her to see an attorney. She promised she would. I didn't know then how serious things had become. Back in the courtroom, Judge Holloway slowly lowered the letter onto his desk. "Counselors," he said carefully, "we are going to pause these proceedings temporarily." Dad stood immediately. "On what grounds?" The judge looked irritated now. "On the grounds that this document appears to substantially alter ownership claims connected to the Bennett estate holdings." Mom leaned forward sharply. "That's impossible." Judge Holloway removed his glasses. "No, Mrs. Bennett. Impossible would be pretending this letter doesn't exist." Daniel finally put down his phone. I could feel all three of them staring at me now like I'd somehow tricked them. But I hadn't tricked anyone. I barely understood what was happening myself. My attorney, Susan Mercer, touched my arm gently. "Claire," she whispered, "did you know about this?" I shook my head. Not fully. Margaret had mailed me the sealed envelope 2 weeks before she died with strict instructions not to open it unless the estate went to court. That was all. Dad suddenly pointed at me across the aisle. "She manipulated an old woman," he snapped. The accusation hit harder than I expected. Not because it was true. Because even after everything, some part of me still hated disappointing him. Susan stood immediately. "Your Honor." But I interrupted her. For the first time that day, I spoke directly to my father. "No," I said quietly. "I spent 30 years protecting people. Margaret was one of them." The room went silent again. Dad stared at me like he didn't recognize the person speaking. Maybe he didn't. Truthfully, sometimes I didn't either. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning pending review of these documents and associated financial records." The gavel struck. People began standing. But my parents remained frozen in their seats, and as the storm outside finally broke into heavy rain against the courthouse windows, I realized something strange for the very first time in my life. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The rain was still coming down hard when I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon. Florida rain has a way of swallowing sound. Cars hissed through puddles along Main Street, thunder rolled somewhere out over the Gulf, and people hurried under umbrellas without looking at each other for very long. Sarasota tourists usually loved the sunshine version of Florida. The real Florida, the wet heat, the storms, the mold creeping up old buildings, the loneliness tucked behind retirement communities was something else entirely. I stood under the courthouse awning for a moment, breathing slowly. My attorney, Susan Mercer, came out beside me carrying 2 thick folders against her chest. Well, she said that was one hell of a surprise. I let out a tired breath. "You're telling me?" Susan had handled elder law and estate disputes in Sarasota for almost 30 years. Mid-60s, sharp as broken glass silver hair cut short enough to mean business. Margaret trusted her completely, which was the only reason I trusted her too. "You really didn't know what was in that letter?" she asked carefully. "Number." "You had no idea Margaret transferred ownership protections." "I knew she was worried," I said, "that's all." Susan studied me quietly for a second, then nodded like she believed me. Because she did. Unlike my family, Susan understood something important about people my age. Most of us are too tired for games. By 62, you either tell the truth or you spend your whole life buried under the weight of lies. "I'll call you tonight after I review the trust documents," she said. "But Claire..."
"What?"
"You may want to prepare yourself. I think your aunt was hiding far more than anyone realized." That didn't surprise me nearly as much as it should have. Because the truth was, Margaret had been frightened for years. I just hadn't fully understood why. Back at my condo near Venice Beach, I changed out of my uniform, slowly hanging each piece carefully the way military habits teach you to do after decades. Some routines never leave your bones. Outside, palm trees bent sharply in the storm winds. I poured myself coffee even though it was already after 5 o'clock. At my age, caffeine after dinner was usually a mistake, but sleep wasn't coming anyway. The condo felt too quiet. That's one thing people never warn you about retirement. Silence gets louder. During my Navy years, there was always noise somewhere: engines, radios, announcements, helicopters, footsteps in corridors at 3 in the morning. Then suddenly one day you're home alone listening to your refrigerator hum. I carried the coffee mug to the living room and stared at the old framed photo sitting beside the television. Margaret and me. Taken 15 years earlier after my promotion ceremony in Norfolk. She had one arm around my shoulders and was grinning proudly at the camera while I stood there awkwardly in dress whites. "You look terrified," she'd laughed afterward. "I hate attention." "Well, too bad," she'd said. "You earned it." I touched the edge of the frame gently. Margaret was the only person in my family who ever said things like that to me. About an hour later, Susan called. I answered immediately. "Sit down," she said without preamble. I am sitting. Good, because this gets complicated. That's how the next 2 hours began. Piece by piece, Susan explained what the judge had discovered. Years earlier, back in 1998, Margaret had quietly established a protected property trust connected to her rental holdings. Not public knowledge. Barely even visible, unless someone knew exactly where to look. And according to the language inside that trust, operational authority transferred automatically to me under certain conditions. Conditions Margaret apparently believed had now been met. I rubbed my forehead slowly. This doesn't make sense. "It makes perfect sense," Susan replied. "Your aunt didn't trust your father." Hearing it stated so plainly hurt more than I expected. Not because it sounded impossible. Because deep down I had known for years she was probably right. Susan continued carefully. "Claire, there's more." "Of course there is. We've uncovered irregular withdrawals tied to several properties over the last decade." I closed my eyes. "How bad?" "Potentially very bad." The room suddenly felt warmer. Susan lowered her voice. Margaret documented concerns that Richard and Daniel were diverting rental income. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, did Margaret know for certain? She suspected enough to start gathering records. My stomach tightened. Because suddenly dozens of old conversations began replaying in my head. Margaret calling me worried about missing invoices. Margaret confused about maintenance costs. Margaret crying once after Daniel yelled at her over repairs. At the time I thought it was family tension. Now I wondered if it had been something far uglier. "You still there?" Susan asked. "Yes. There's something else you need to know before tomorrow." I braced myself. "The court accountant found evidence that you personally covered multiple property tax shortages over the years." I blinked. "What?" "Wire transfers from overseas accounts linked to your Navy payroll." Now I understood. Margaret. She must have documented every time I sent money to help her. I leaned back against the couch, slowly exhausted all at once. Over the years, I'd wired her money quietly whenever emergencies happened: roof repairs after hurricanes, plumbing failures, insurance gaps, overdue taxes once or twice. Not because I expected anything in return. Because she needed help. That was it. But I never told my parents. Especially my father. Richard Bennett believed helping family financially made people weak. Unless Daniel needed help. Then somehow it became protecting the future. Funny how those rules changed, depending on which child he was talking about. After hanging up with Susan, I sat alone in the dark for a long time, listening to the storm outside. Eventually, my phone buzzed again. "Daniel." I almost ignored it. Almost. What I answered. His voice came sharp immediately. "What the hell did you do?" "Good evening to you too." "You blindsided Dad in court." "No," I said calmly. "Margaret did." "You manipulated her." I laughed softly then. Not because anything was funny. Because some accusations become ridiculous after enough years. "Daniel," I said quietly, "when was the last time you even visited Margaret without asking for something?" Silence. Then anger. "You think you're better than us because you wore a uniform." "No," I replied. "I think I kept my promises better." That hit him. I could hear it. "You abandoned this family for 30 years. The old accusation. The familiar one." I looked around my empty condo at the photographs from deployments, retirement ceremonies, Navy friends now dead or scattered across the country. "Funny," I said softly. "I spent 30 years serving people who treated me with more respect than my own family ever did." Daniel cursed under his breath. Then he hung up. I set the phone down carefully. Outside, thunder rattled the windows, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder exactly how much Margaret had been protecting me from all these years. The next morning, the courthouse looked different. Not physically. Emotionally. Word had spread overnight. By the time I entered the courtroom, reporters were already gathered near the entrance, whispering about trust fraud investigations and hidden property transfers. Dad looked furious. Mom looked frightened. Daniel looked exhausted. And sitting on the clerk's table near the judge's bench were 4 large cardboard archive boxes filled with financial records. Judge Holloway entered quietly. No small talk this time. He adjusted his glasses, glanced toward my parents, then toward me, and said the words that truly began unraveling my family. After reviewing preliminary evidence, he announced this court has serious concerns regarding possible financial misconduct connected to the Bennett estate. My father stood abruptly. This is outrageous. But the judge didn't even look at him. Instead, he opened the first file from the accountant's box. And everything started falling apart. My father had spent his entire life believing confidence could overpower truth. That strategy worked surprisingly well for him over the years. Until the accountants arrived. By 10 o'clock that morning, the courtroom felt less like a probate hearing and more like a slow-moving disaster nobody could stop. Thick binders covered the tables. Bank statements, repair invoices, tax records, refinancing agreements, all stacked in neat piles while reporters scribbled notes from the back row. Judge Holloway looked exhausted already. So did I. Dad, however, still looked angry more than worried. That was typical Richard Bennett behavior. He treated every problem like an insult instead of a warning. Daniel sat beside him, tapping one nervous foot against the floor. Mom kept whispering things under her breath that nobody answered. I sat quietly next to Susan, watching 20 years of family lies begin surfacing one page at a time. Your Honor, the forensic accountant said carefully, our preliminary review indicates substantial irregularities involving several Bennett properties between 2009 and 2024. Dad scoffed loudly. Irregularities. That's a dramatic word for bookkeeping errors. The accountant didn't react. Older professionals usually don't. He simply adjusted his glasses and continued. We identified repeated transfers from tenant operating accounts into unrelated private business accounts connected to Daniel Bennett. Now every head in the courtroom turned toward my brother. Daniel immediately straightened. That doesn't prove anything. The accountant opened another folder. It also appears multiple maintenance reserves were depleted while tenants were informed repairs could not be afforded. A cold heaviness settled in my chest. Because suddenly I remembered dozens of conversations with Margaret over the years. The leaking roof in Bradenton. The broken air conditioning units during August heat. The elderly tenant whose plumbing failed after a hurricane. Margaret always sounded embarrassed asking me for help. Just temporary, she'd promise. I'll pay you back. I never let her. But now I finally understood why the shortages never seemed to end. Judge Holloway looked toward Daniel. Mr. Bennett, do you wish to respond? Daniel glanced immediately at Dad before speaking. That tiny movement told me everything. It was complicated, Daniel muttered. Dad leaned forward sharply. My son managed those properties under extremely difficult market conditions. Susan finally spoke. Interesting, because tax records show rising rental income during the same period. The courtroom went quiet again. My father's jaw tightened. That expression used to terrify me when I was young. By 62, it mostly made me sad. The accountant continued reviewing findings for nearly another hour. Unauthorized refinancing. Missing maintenance funds. Insurance discrepancies. Deferred repairs. And underneath all of it sat the same ugly truth nobody wanted to say aloud. Daniel had been draining money from the properties for years, while Dad protected him. At one point, Judge Holloway removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead slowly. How extensive are these losses? The accountant flipped several pages. Potentially several $1 million over time. Mom gasped softly. Daniel muttered, that's exaggerated. But nobody sounded convinced anymore. Especially not me. Because for the first time in my life, the math of my childhood suddenly made sense. The favoritism. The excuses. The endless rescuing. Dad wasn't just emotionally invested in Daniel. He was financially trapped in him. The realization hit harder than I expected. Susan leaned toward me quietly. "You okay?" I nodded once. But I wasn't. Because old memories kept surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. I remembered being 14 years old and standing in our Jacksonville kitchen while Dad yelled at me for denting the car bumper. "You don't pay attention," he snapped. Meanwhile, Daniel had crashed a motorcycle 6 months earlier and somehow gotten sympathy instead of punishment. I remembered graduating near the top of my ROTC class while Dad skipped the ceremony because Daniel had a tennis tournament. I remembered coming home from my first deployment and listening to my parents brag about Daniel's new boat for nearly 2 straight hours without asking me a single question about where I'd been. And somehow, despite all that, part of me still spent decades trying to earn their approval. That's the cruel thing about family. Even neglected children keep hoping eventually they'll be loved correctly. Around noon, the courtroom recessed briefly. I stepped outside into the humid Florida air hoping to clear my head. Instead, I found Mrs. Delgado waiting near the courthouse benches. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Then she smiled softly. "Claire." My chest tightened instantly. Mrs. Elena Delgado had rented one of Margaret's duplex units for nearly 20 years. Widowed, retired school cafeteria worker, tiny woman with silver curls and tired eyes. I hugged her carefully. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about the hearing," she said. "I wanted to support you." Emotion caught me off guard. Because support was still something I never quite expected naturally. Mrs. Delgado squeezed my hand. "Your aunt loved you very much." I swallowed hard. I loved her too. She hesitated before speaking again. "There were times Margaret cried after Daniel visited." Anger flickered inside me. Not explosive anger. The slower kind older people carry quietly after years of disappointment. "What did he do?" Mrs. Delgado lowered her voice. "He pressured her about money. Sometimes she'd sit outside afterward shaking." That image nearly broke me. Margaret alone on those old concrete steps trying not to cry where tenants could see her. And I had been halfway around the world thinking phone calls were enough. Mrs. Delgado smiled sadly. "But she always said you protected people." I looked away toward the rain-darkened streets. "I tried." "No," she said gently, "you did." When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed. Even Dad looked less certain now. Then the accountant introduced the refinancing records, and everything became worse. Several property loans contain authorization signatures attributed to Margaret Bennett, he explained. Susan stood immediately. "We request forensic review of those signatures." Dad exploded. "This is insanity." Judge Holloway's voice hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett." Dad remained standing another second too long before finally lowering himself into his chair. I watched him carefully then. Really watched him. And for the first time in my life I saw fear. Not anger. Fear. Daniel leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Dad shook his head sharply. The accountant continued. "One particular refinancing agreement from 2018 raises serious concerns regarding authenticity." Susan turned toward me quietly. "If those signatures were forged?" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Forgery against an elderly woman in a trust dispute wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. Mom suddenly looked very small sitting there between them. Not innocent. But smaller. Older. Tired. That surprised me more than anything else that day. Because I had spent so many years viewing my parents as emotionally indestructible forces that I forgot age catches everyone eventually. Even proud people. Judge Holloway called another recess late that afternoon. As people stood and gathered papers, my father suddenly crossed the courtroom toward me. Susan moved immediately to intercept him, but I touched her arm lightly. "It's okay." Dad stopped only a few feet away. Up close, he looked older than I remembered. Deep lines around his mouth, thin patches in his hair, skin beginning to sag beneath his jaw. Time had finally reached him too. "You think this makes you righteous?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes calmly. "Number. You're humiliating this family." The old accusation again. Family loyalty. Silence. Protection at any cost. I felt strangely calm suddenly. "You humiliated this family yourself," I said. His expression hardened. Then, for one brief second, something cracked underneath it. Not guilt, exactly. More like confusion. As if he genuinely couldn't understand how we arrived here. Maybe because people who spend decades justifying small dishonesties eventually lose track of where the line was originally supposed to be. Dad glanced around the courtroom filled with reporters, lawyers, and accountants. Then back at me. "You always thought you were better than us." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said quietly. "I just learned how to survive without you." He stared at me for several long seconds, then walked away without another word. And as I watched him leave, I realized something painful. The strongest wound parents leave behind isn't hatred. It's the lifelong ache of never feeling chosen. The next morning, the courthouse parking lot was already crowded before sunrise. News vans lined the curb outside. Reporters stood under umbrellas drinking coffee from paper cups, while camera crews adjusted equipment in the damp Florida heat. Somewhere nearby, seagulls screamed over the harbor like they always did before storms. I sat alone inside my car for several minutes before going in. At my age, you learn the value of pausing before difficult things. Not avoiding them. Just breathing first. My hands rested on the steering wheel while I stared at the courthouse entrance. The reflection in the windshield showed a woman with tired eyes, silver threading through dark hair, and 30 years of military posture she still couldn't quite turn off. I barely recognized myself sometimes, not because I'd changed, because I'd spent so much of my life becoming whoever survival required. Finally, I picked up my coffee and walked inside. Courtroom 3 felt colder than usual that morning. Dad sat rigidly beside Daniel, jaw clenched hard enough to show through his cheeks. Mom avoided eye contact entirely. Susan leaned toward me quietly. "You ready?" "No," I admitted. She nodded. "Good. Only liars are ever completely ready for days like this." Judge Holloway entered promptly at 9. No delays. No pleasantries. He carried a thick folder in one hand and looked grim. After everyone settled, he opened the file slowly. "This court has completed preliminary verification regarding the Bennett Family Property Trust established in 1998. The room became still instantly. Even reporters stopped moving. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses. "The trust appears legally valid and enforceable." Dad inhaled sharply beside me. Then came the sentence that truly shattered my family. "If anything happens to me," the judge read aloud from Margaret's letter, "all controlling ownership transfers immediately to Claire Bennett under the protected trust established in 1998. Gasps spread quietly through the courtroom. My own breath caught. Even hearing the words directly, I still struggled to absorb them. Margaret had done this 28 years earlier. 28. Back when I was still serving overseas regularly, back before Daniel's debt spiraled, back before the properties became battlegrounds. She had planned for this possibility decades ago. Dad stood abruptly. "This is absurd." Judge Holloway didn't even look up. The trust further specifies that operational control bypasses any beneficiary shown to have financially exploited protected assets or elderly ownership. Daniel muttered something under his breath. Susan whispered, "That's why the letter changed everything." My father looked furious now. "No," he snapped loudly. "Margaret was manipulated." The judge finally looked at him. "Mr. Bennett, 3 separate attorneys verified this trust over the years." Silence. Then the judge continued reading. "The trust additionally prohibits displacement of tenants over age 65 without documented cause. Properties may not be converted into speculative luxury developments." I suddenly understood why Dad wanted control so badly. The land itself had become enormously valuable over time. Florida coastal property always does. Luxury developers had probably been circling those buildings for years like vultures. But Margaret protected them. Protected the tenants. Protected the community. And somehow protected me too. Judge Holloway lowered the papers carefully. In summary, Mrs. Margaret Bennett intentionally structured these holdings to remain affordable community housing under Claire Bennett's supervision. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me again. Not with suspicion this time. With curiosity. Maybe even respect. It felt unfamiliar. Daniel suddenly slammed both hands against the table. "This is insane." The sound echoed sharply through the courtroom. Mom jumped. Dad grabbed Daniel's arm. "Sit down." "No," Daniel snapped. "You told me everything was handled." The words landed like a gunshot. Dad's face changed instantly. Not anger this time. Panic. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Bennett, are you suggesting prior awareness of disputed ownership conditions?" "No," Dad said quickly. "Of course not." But the damage was done. Daniel was unraveling. Years of pressure debt and entitlement were finally cracking open in public. "You said she'd never challenge us," Daniel hissed toward Dad. I stared at my brother quietly. For the first time, he didn't look spoiled. He looked scared. Truly scared. And beneath the fear sat something sadder. A man who had spent his whole life being rescued and therefore never learned how to stand on his own. The courtroom recessed briefly after noon. I stepped into the hallway near the vending machines, hoping for a few minutes alone. Instead, Mom followed me. "Claire." Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I turned slowly. Up close, she suddenly looked every bit of her 83 years. Carefully styled hair couldn't hide exhaustion anymore. Neither could pearls. Neither could pride. What I asked gently. She folded her hands tightly together. "You don't understand how hard things became." I almost laughed. Not cruelly. "Just tired." "Mom," I said quietly, "I spent most of my adult life deployed in war zones." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Tears suddenly filled her eyes. Real tears. Not dramatic ones. "Your father was trying to save the family." The sentence hit me harder than anger would have. Because somewhere deep down I knew she believed it. That's how families survive dysfunction for decades. People convince themselves harmful choices are acts of protection. I leaned against the wall slowly. "By stealing from Margaret." Mom looked away. No one thought it would go this far. There it was. The truth underneath most disasters. Nobody plans for the collapse. They just keep justifying small wrong decisions until eventually those decisions become a life. I studied my mother carefully. "Did you know Daniel was taking money?" Silence. Then softly, "I knew your father kept helping him." Not the same answer. And we both knew it. I closed my eyes briefly. "When did you stop seeing me as your daughter?" I asked before I could stop myself. Mom looked stunned. "Claire." "No," I said quietly. "I genuinely want to know." She stared down at the courthouse tile floor. "You were always so distant." The old misunderstanding again. As if independence and emotional neglect were the same thing. "I was stationed overseas," I said. "You never needed us." That one nearly broke my heart. Because finally, after 60 years, I understood the terrible logic of my family. Daniel received love because he stayed dependent. I lost it because I learned how to survive alone. Mom's voice trembled. "Your father thought Daniel needed more support." I nodded slowly. "And what did you think I needed?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because she didn't know. Maybe she never had. Back inside the courtroom, proceedings resumed quietly. Then the forensic handwriting specialist testified. And the room changed again. After reviewing multiple refinancing documents, the specialist concluded one of Margaret's signatures had significant indicators of forgery. Mom covered her mouth. Daniel stared straight ahead, motionless. Dad looked furious. But underneath the anger now sat defeat. The kind older people recognize immediately. The moment someone realizes consequences have finally outrun excuses. Judge Holloway spoke carefully. "This court will refer potential criminal findings to state investigators pending full review." The reporters practically exploded into motion. Questions flew immediately once proceedings adjourned. Cameras turned toward Dad. Toward Daniel. Toward me. I slipped quietly out a side hallway before anyone could stop me. Outside, the rain had finally ended. The late afternoon sun broke weakly through the clouds, turning the wet pavement gold. I stood there alone, breathing in damp salt air from the Gulf. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I cried. Not because I'd won. Because I suddenly understood how deeply broken my family had always been. Aunt Margaret saw it decades ago. She built that trust because she knew eventually someone would have to stop the damage. And somehow, despite everything, she believed that person was me. By the 5th day of hearings, my father looked 10 years older. Pride ages people faster than hard work ever does. The sharp confidence he carried into court that first morning had started collapsing around the edges. His ties hung looser now. His shoulders sagged when he thought nobody was watching. Even his voice sounded thinner. Daniel looked worse. The newspapers had begun publishing details from the investigation, and Sarasota being Sarasota word spread quickly among golf clubs, restaurants, church groups, and retirement communities. Older towns remember scandals differently than younger places do. News travels slowly at first, then suddenly everybody knows. And everybody talks. That Thursday morning I stopped at a small diner near the courthouse before proceedings began. Same diner Margaret loved for years. Red vinyl booths, cheap coffee, waitresses who called everyone honey whether they knew your name or not. I sat alone near the window watching traffic crawl through the wet streets while stirring powdered creamer into my coffee. Then someone touched my shoulder gently. "Commander Bennett." I turned. An older man stood there holding a Navy veteran cap in both hands. Mid-70s maybe, thin frame, weathered skin. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "Not at all." He smiled awkwardly. "I rented from Margaret for 13 years over in Bradenton." Recognition flickered. "Mr. Harlan." His face brightened immediately. "You remember me?" "Of course I do." Years earlier, after Hurricane Ian damaged several units, Margaret called me frantic because Mr. Harlan's roof had partially collapsed. I spent 2 straight nights coordinating emergency repairs remotely from Bahrain because local contractors were overwhelmed. At the time, I barely thought about it. That's just what you do when someone needs help. Mr. Harlan sat carefully across from me. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" He laughed softly. "For treating us like human beings." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Older people understand the weight of simple dignity better than anyone. Mr. Harlan lowered his voice. "Daniel tried raising rents 3 different times after Margaret got sick." I stared quietly. "He told us luxury developers were interested," Mr. Harlan continued. "Said seniors like us were holding property values back." Anger moved through me slowly then. Not hot anger. Cold anger. The kind that settles deep after too many years of watching greed disguise itself as business. Mr. Harlan shook his head sadly. "Margaret always stopped him." I looked down at my coffee cup. "She protected people." "Yes," he said softly, "so did you." That sentence stayed with me all morning. Back in court, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The reporters no longer chased me. They chased my father. Judge Holloway entered carrying additional financial summaries, while state investigators sat quietly near the rear benches taking notes. Dad noticed them immediately. His hands started trembling slightly. That frightened me more than I expected. Because no matter how complicated family becomes, seeing your father afraid still does something to your heart. The proceedings focused heavily on Daniel that day. Credit card debts, casino withdrawals, luxury vehicle leases, failed business investments. One after another, the records painted the same ugly picture. Daniel had been drowning financially for years. And Dad kept trying to save him, at everyone else's expense. Finally, Judge Holloway looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Bennett, why did you continue borrowing against these properties?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "You really want the honest answer?" "Yes." My brother leaned back slowly in his chair. "Because my father always told me family would protect me." Silence. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel looked toward Dad. "You fixed every mistake I ever made." Dad's jaw tightened. "I was helping my son." "No," Daniel snapped suddenly. "You were keeping me weak." The room went still. Even the reporters stopped typing. And there it was at last. The truth nobody in our family had ever spoken aloud. Favoritism doesn't only damage the neglected child. It destroys the favored one too. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face shakily. "I never learned consequences," he admitted quietly. Mom started crying beside him. Real crying this time. Not polished tears. Old woman tears. The kind that come from finally seeing damage clearly after years of denial. I watched them silently from across the courtroom, feeling something strange and uncomfortable. Not victory. Grief. Because revenge stories sound satisfying when you're younger. But real life at 62 feels different. Watching your family collapse doesn't heal old wounds. It just proves they were real all along. Around midday, court recessed briefly again. This time, Susan pulled me aside near the clerk's office. "You holding up?" "I think so." She studied me carefully. "You know you don't have to keep wearing armor anymore." I almost smiled. "Military habit." "No," Susan said gently, "emotional habit." That one landed. Because she was right. I had spent my entire life learning composure. In the Navy, composure keeps people alive. In families, sometimes it just keeps people distant. Susan handed me another folder. Margaret left additional instructions regarding the properties. I opened it slowly. Inside were handwritten notes in Margaret's shaky cursive. Affordable rent protections, veteran housing assistance, emergency hurricane funds for elderly tenants, community meal programs during storm evacuations. I stared at the pages quietly. This wasn't just property management. It was stewardship. Margaret hadn't spent decades building investments. She'd spent decades building stability for vulnerable people. And somehow she trusted me to continue it. I suddenly felt the weight of that responsibility more than the money itself. "Why me?" I whispered. Susan answered softly, "Because she knew character matters more than charm." Back inside court, the final testimony of the afternoon focused on forged refinancing signatures. The handwriting expert confirmed again that Margaret likely did not authorize at least one major loan agreement. State investigators requested copies immediately. Dad looked physically ill now. Then something happened I never expected. As proceedings adjourned, Dad stood too quickly. His face drained pale. One hand grabbed the table edge sharply. Richard, Mom gasped. The courtroom erupted instantly. Dad staggered once before collapsing backward into his chair, clutching his chest. Everything blurred for a moment after that. Paramedics, reporters shouting, Daniel yelling for space, Mom crying uncontrollably, and me, moving automatically. Military training never really leaves you. I reached Dad before anyone else did. "Breathe," I ordered firmly while checking his pulse. His terrified eyes locked onto mine. For one strange second he looked less like my father, and more like an old, frightened man who suddenly realized his body could fail him. "Claire," he whispered weakly. "It's okay," I said automatically. The paramedics arrived seconds later. They stabilized him quickly while asking questions. Possible cardiac episode. Elevated stress. Transport recommended immediately. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps like vultures. Daniel shoved cameras away angrily. Mom looked completely shattered. And I stood there in the humid Florida evening feeling exhausted beyond words. Not triumphant. Just tired. Because somewhere between childhood and old age, most revenge fantasies quietly die. What remains instead is the painful realization that damaged people often damage others without fully understanding what they're doing. That doesn't excuse the harm, but it changes the shape of anger. Late that night, after the courthouse emptied and the rain finally stopped, Mom called me from the hospital. Her voice sounded small. "Your father wants to see you." I stared out at the dark Gulf waters from my condo balcony for a long moment before answering. Then finally asked the question I never thought I would. Why? I didn't go to the hospital that night. At least not immediately. Instead, I sat on my condo balcony listening to waves roll softly against the dark shoreline, while Mom's question kept circling inside my head. "Your father wants to see you." For most of my life, hearing that sentence would have filled me with anxiety. Usually it meant criticism, disappointment, some fresh reminder that I had somehow failed to become the daughter my father wanted. But now things were different. Now Richard Bennett was 86 years old, lying in a cardiac unit with state investigators reviewing forged financial documents connected to his family business. Age strips power from people in strange ways, especially men who built their identities around control. Around midnight, I finally drove to Sarasota Memorial Hospital. The fluorescent lights in hospital corridors always feel the same no matter where you are in America, cold, sleepless, and strangely timeless. I passed nurses sipping coffee at stations, exhausted family members slumped in waiting room chairs, muted televisions glowing overhead with weather reports nobody was truly watching. Mom stood when she saw me approach. Her eyes were swollen red. "He's awake," she whispered. I nodded once. Neither of us knew how to behave around each other anymore. Maybe we never had. She touched my arm awkwardly before I entered the room. And suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. My mother was afraid of me now. Not physically. Morally. As if truth itself had become frightening. Dad looked smaller in the hospital bed than I'd ever seen him. Machines beeped softly around him while rain tapped against the windows again outside. Florida storms never seemed to fully leave this week. He turned his head slowly when I entered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a weak half-laugh. "Well," he muttered, "this is humiliating." I pulled a chair closer and sat carefully. "You're alive," I said, "that's what matters." Dad studied me quietly. "Still wearing emotional armor even now. I suppose you'd know about survival better than me." The comment almost sounded respectful. That alone felt strange. I folded my hands together. "What did you want to say?" He looked away toward the rain-darkened window. "I don't know where things went wrong." I could have answered that question 100 different ways. Instead, I asked one of my own. "When did you decide Daniel mattered more than me?" Dad closed his eyes briefly. "That's not fair." "No," I said softly. What wasn't fair was spending 60 years pretending I didn't notice. Silence filled the room again. Hospital silence feels heavier somehow. "Older." Dad swallowed hard before speaking. "You were always stronger." I stared at him. There it was. The explanation beneath everything. "You thought strength meant I needed less love." He rubbed tired fingers against the blanket. "Your brother struggled." And I didn't. "You handled things." The old misunderstanding again? Competence mistaken for emotional invulnerability. It happens in families all the time. Especially to daughters. I leaned back slowly in the chair. "You know what military life taught me?" I asked quietly. Dad looked over. That people who seem strongest are usually carrying the heaviest loads. Something shifted in his face then. Not defensiveness. Recognition. Painfully late recognition. He looked suddenly very tired. "I never understood you," he admitted. The honesty startled me. Not because it fixed anything. Because it was probably the truest thing he'd ever said to me. Rainwater streaked down the hospital window behind him while monitors beeped softly beside the bed. Finally, he asked the question I think had haunted him all week. "Do you hate me?" I thought about it carefully before answering. At 62, I've learned people deserve truthful answers more than dramatic ones. "No," I said softly, "I grieved you." Dad's eyes filled immediately. And suddenly I saw it happen. The moment my father finally understood that emotional neglect leaves wounds just as real as cruelty. Maybe worse sometimes. Because neglected children grow up believing they simply weren't worth choosing. Dad turned his face away slightly. "I thought pushing you made you stronger." "No," I said gently, "the Navy made me stronger, you just made me lonely." He covered his eyes with one hand then. And for the first time in my entire life I watched my father cry. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Quiet old man tears. The kind people cry when they finally see themselves clearly. I sat there silently while years of anger softened into something sadder and more human. Because age changes revenge too. When you're young, you want people who hurt you to suffer. When you're older, sometimes you just wish they had loved you better while there was still time. After a while, Dad lowered his hand again. "I resented you," he admitted hoarsely. That surprised me enough to still my breathing. "Why?" "Because you didn't need me." The sentence echoed painfully through the room. There it was again. Dependence mistaken for love. Independence mistaken for rejection. Dad looked exhausted now. "You built a life without this family," he whispered, "and I didn't know where I fit in it." I shook my head slowly. "You could have fit anywhere," I said. "You just kept choosing Daniel instead." The truth hung between us quietly. Dad didn't deny it. Because finally even he couldn't anymore. The next afternoon I drove to the Bradenton properties alone. I needed to see them again outside courtrooms and legal files. The buildings weren't fancy. Faded paint, old railings, storm shutters still stacked near entrances from hurricane season. But they were clean. Stable. Lived in. Mrs. Delgado waved when she spotted me walking the property grounds. "So many people are worried," she said softly. "About what?" "That developers will still come." I looked around slowly. An elderly veteran watered tomato plants beside one porch. 2 widows sat talking beneath a palm tree. Someone played old country music softly through an open screen door. Community. That's what Margaret protected. Not buildings. People. And suddenly I understood my responsibility much more clearly. Not revenge. Stewardship. Later that evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded hollow. "My wife left." I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." "No," he said quietly, "you're not." The truth was complicated. I didn't want his life destroyed. But I also couldn't pretend consequences weren't deserved. "She said I've spent my whole life acting like somebody else would always save me," he admitted. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he laughed bitterly. "She was probably right." I stared out toward the Gulf again. "You can still change," I said quietly. "Can I?" The sadness in his voice startled me. Because beneath all the arrogance and entitlement, Daniel sounded lost. Like a little boy who never learned how to become an adult properly. And maybe that's exactly what he was. Before hanging up, he said something I never expected to hear from him. "I think you were the only honest person in this family." After the call ended, I sat alone in the dark, thinking about how much damage favoritism leaves behind, not only for the ignored child, but for the favored one too. Then my phone buzzed again. A text from Mom. "Your father wants to apologize." I stared at the screen for a very long time. Because some words arrive decades too late. But sometimes they still matter anyway. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was finally quiet. No reporters crowded the steps anymore. No television vans blocked the parking spaces. The scandal had already begun fading into the endless stream of newer headlines Americans move on to every day. That's another thing age teaches you. The world rarely pauses for personal heartbreak. Life just keeps moving. By then, most of the legal matters had been settled. The state investigation into the forged refinancing documents was still ongoing, but Dad's attorneys negotiated agreements that prevented criminal prosecution in exchange for full financial restitution, property oversight cooperation, and permanent withdrawal from trust management. Judge Holloway approved the final structure on a rainy Tuesday morning. The properties would remain protected community housing under the Margaret Bennett Trust. Affordable rent caps stayed in place. Senior tenant protections expanded. Emergency hurricane funds were fully restored. And several units would now be reserved specifically for low-income veterans. When the judge finalized the paperwork, he looked directly at me. "Ms. Bennett," he said carefully, "your aunt chose wisely." I didn't know how to answer that. Because even now I still wasn't entirely sure I deserved the faith Margaret placed in me. Outside the courthouse, Susan hugged me tightly. "You did good," she said. "No," I replied softly. "Margaret did." Susan smiled sadly. "Sometimes the best people leave their courage behind for someone else to carry." That stayed with me. A week later, we held Margaret's memorial service near the Gulf. Nothing extravagant. That would have embarrassed her. Just folding chairs beneath a covered pavilion overlooking the water, coffee in cardboard containers, trays of sandwiches from a local deli she loved, and about 80 people whose lives she'd quietly touched over the years. Tenants, veterans, neighbors, church friends, maintenance workers, people society often overlooks. The weather turned strangely beautiful that afternoon. Warm breeze, pale sunlight breaking through clouds, pelicans drifting low across the water. I wore civilian clothes for once. Simple navy slacks and a white blouse. No medals. No rank. Just Claire. Mrs. Delgado hugged me first. Then Mr. Harlan. Then half the tenants lined up to share stories about Margaret helping with medicine costs, groceries, after hurricanes, rent delays during illnesses, rides to doctor appointments. Small acts. But older people understand small acts are what hold communities together. Daniel arrived late. He looked thinner now, quieter. Real life had finally reached him. He approached awkwardly while people mingled beneath the pavilion. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "I'm glad you did." He shoved his hands into his pockets. I started working with the maintenance crews. I nodded slowly. I heard? Turns out Daniel had taken a full-time job handling repairs across several trust properties after the hearings ended. Not management. Actual work. Plumbing calls. Storm prep. Roof inspections. At first I assumed it was temporary desperation. But maybe it wasn't. I'm learning things, he said quietly. Like what? He gave a tired laugh, like how hard normal people work. There was no arrogance left in him when he said it. Only embarrassment. Growth often sounds like embarrassment in the beginning. Before I could answer, Mom approached carefully. And behind her came Dad. He walked slower now. The hospital stay changed him physically. Age suddenly sat heavier on his shoulders, and the old forcefulness in his posture had softened into something more fragile. Consequence leaves visible marks eventually. Conversations around us gradually quieted as people noticed him approaching. Dad looked nervous. I honestly couldn't remember ever seeing my father nervous before. Then he surprised everyone, including me. He turned toward the small crowd gathered beneath the pavilion and cleared his throat. I need to say something. The breeze moved softly through the palm trees nearby while everyone waited. Dad looked out toward the gulf for a moment before speaking again. I spent most of my life believing providing money made me a good father. His voice trembled slightly. I was wrong. Complete silence settled over the pavilion. Even the waves seemed quieter somehow. Dad looked toward Daniel first. I protected my son from consequences until he never learned responsibility. Daniel lowered his eyes. Then Dad turned toward me. And suddenly I was 10 years old again for one terrible second, waiting to hear whether I had disappointed him. But this time was different. I confused control with love, he said hoarsely, and by the time I realized it, I almost lost my daughter forever. Emotion tightened painfully in my throat. Dad swallowed hard before continuing. Claire spent her life serving other people while I spent years treating her like she owed me proof of her worth. Mom began crying softly beside him. So today Dad whispered, I want to say publicly what I should have said decades ago. He looked directly at me then. You became the strongest and most honorable person in this family. I couldn't speak. For 60 years I imagined hearing words like that. And somehow, now that they finally came, they felt less victorious than heartbreaking. Because no apology returns lost time. Still, some wounds heal crooked instead of clean. And maybe that has to be enough sometimes. Dad stepped closer slowly. I'm sorry, Claire. Not polished. Not perfect. But real. And after a long moment I hugged him. The crowd quietly looked away, giving us privacy older generations understand without being asked for. Dad's shoulders shook slightly while he held on to me. Not because everything was fixed. Because truth finally had nowhere left to hide. Later that evening, after everyone left, I walked alone along the shoreline behind the pavilion. The Florida sunset stretched gold across the gulf while waves rolled gently over wet sand. I thought about Margaret. About the Navy. About all the years I spent believing strength meant enduring loneliness silently. Maybe I was wrong about that too. Inheritance isn't really about property. Or money. Or courtrooms. It's about what people leave behind inside other human beings. Margaret left compassion. The Navy left discipline. My parents, despite all the pain, left lessons too. And maybe growing older means accepting that even damaged families can still leave something worth carrying forward. If this story touched something in your own life, whether you were the overlooked child, the favored one, or the parent who wishes they had done better, I hope you remember this. Love given conditionally leaves scars that last for decades, but honesty, accountability, and kindness still have the power to heal what pride nearly destroys. And if there's someone you still need to speak honestly with while time allows it, don't wait too long. Thank you for listening to my story.